I have ideas about story collections. I think when a lot of new writers first publish a collection, there's always the temptation to put together everything they've written, to get as much of it out into the public eye as possible. So they'll sort of grab 20 stories from the last 5 years that they've written and put them all together. And as a reader, I've always found collections like that unsatisfying because they don't seem to form a whole. I really enjoy collections that seem to form, they're different from novels, but they can do different things. You can actually form a small, little compact body of work. I love the writing of Alice Munro for precisely that reason. If you read an Alice Munro collection, you never sort of get the sense that she's just lumped it together. You get the feeling that it's really, each story is in there for a reason, and that even if the subject matter between each story is very different, you get a sense of threads holding them together, and I love that kind of collection. Even with my first story collection, it's called A Thread of Truth. At that point in time, I'd published probably 10, 15, 20 stories, I can't remember, but certainly a lot more than are in that collection. And I took a long time to decide what was going to go in there. I wanted them to feel as though they naturally belong together. With The Silver Wind and a story collection I've just put together, again I call it a story cycle, it's just been published in the UK, called Stardust. That process is even more clear because there are definite defining links between the stories, and I wrote the stories in The Silver Wind, all of them over a sort of 2-year period, exploring the same themes. They were always meant to go together, and they were in a sense meant to be a book. They weren't meant to be just short stories. They were there together, and that's how they're meant to be read. So that is why I chose the title Story Cycle, very deliberately. It's a fascinating story. It's because, again, the translator, Bernard Sigel, he read Darkroom in an anthology. While I was working on that story, I was also I had other stories from The Silver Wind. That was my big ongoing project at the time. But I broke off from doing that to write Darkroom. And you can see when you read them, even more so than I actually realised. I didn't sort of think about it so much at the time. But when you read them, you can see the links are quite strange and eerie. You've got a character, the central character throughout The Silver Wind, whose name is Martin Newland. He becomes a fictional character in Darkroom, so I used him, and he's doing the same things. I reread, before coming over to Paris just last week, I reread the whole collection and including Darkroom, and I was delighted to find how well that fitted. And I agree. But when Bernard originally asked me, can I include Darkroom, and I said yes, that's absolutely fine. And I was so happy when I reread them that he had seen that and suggested it, because it's a lovely little prologue to the collection, really. I like the way it fitted. I think that's a very beautiful way of putting it, and I think you've got it exactly. It is open to interpretation, and every reader will access these stories differently and will pick up different links. And I have a firm belief as a writer that while I am writing, while I'm creating the stories, they're entirely mine, and I don't let them out until I am happy with what I've done. But once I've done that, once I'm happy and it's gone to the publisher and it's out there, these works then belong to the reader, and I am always so thrilled when different people say to me different meanings that they discern in the stories, and I find that really exciting. What a writer creates is always bigger than themselves, or it should be. That's what one should aspire to as a writer, I think, and if I've achieved that in any way at all, then it's doing its job. People have really different relationships with cities. A lot of people find large cities like London, like Paris, they find them anonymous. They find that anonymity very threatening. They feel lost in those environments. I have always felt enormously at home in big cities. I don't know Paris very well. It's like a sort of counterpart of London in the feel. It has that layering of time, layering of different quartiers, and that just sort of that sense of past, present and future existing in the same place. The thing I love about London is that you can choose how much contact you have with people, but you're never alone. I find the fact of being surrounded by people but not having to interact with them if you don't want to, I find that very restful. I like to hear and see people around me, but as a writer, solitude is crucially important, and the space to actually think. And I do love London. I also think it's fantastically beautiful. I love the London suburbs because that to me is London, the centre, the Big Ben and Houses of Parliament and Buckingham Palace. To me that's common space, that's where everyone sees London, we share that, but the real London is when you take a train out into the outlying reaches and no tourists go there, it's just the people who live there. But there's so much, there's the architectural gems and sort of hidden parks of London. It's one of the greenest cities in the world. You could literally spend a whole lifetime in nowhere else but London and not see the end of it, and it's like a world within a world. Everyone has really important moments in their life. You could call it a crossroads, where you could take one decision or another. You could go and take up a scholarship in America, or you could marry your childhood sweetheart and stay in your village, or you could cross the road at one particular wrong moment, or you could decide not to. And there's a lot of talk in physics about the very real possibility of parallel worlds and how time fractures at every given moment, and I find that it's absolutely fascinating. And I am not a scientist, I come from the literary side rather than the scientific side, but these ideas are just infinite in imaginative potential, and really the book is about that. It's about how everything could pan out differently if one thing was different, or what if Martin did this, or what if he didn't. It's this sense that we are all essentially many people. We have the potential for living many lives. When we're born, we've got this infinity within us, which gradually gets narrowed the further you go down your life. You're shutting off doors all the time. This idea of you could be anyone and anything could happen. For me, I suppose he's always the same Martin, but that's, because I was writing about him for like 2 years, so there's always that same core of his personality, which is somebody who finds himself in extraordinary situations. He's a fundamentally ordinary man. He is actually driven into action by something that happens. Whatever happens in the story is a catalyst to Martin's own development. If you make the decision to become a writer and do it seriously and it is going to be your life, in a way, when you make that decision, you give up any claim to a normal life. In a sense, you don't ever live in the present properly ever again, except in very intense moments. You might be sort of like with a lover or on a very, very special trip somewhere, and you're sort of like, even then though, you're recording, you're conscious, you're super conscious, hyper conscious of what is happening to you, in a way that people living their lives are not you. It's not that I believe that anyone can do this. Most people are talented at telling stories when they're very young. People tell stories almost without thinking. They make things up. They enter imaginative worlds. You only have to see children playing with bricks or dolls or making model spacecraft. At that moment, they are creating those worlds and they're telling themselves stories. They make drawings, they're telling themselves stories. That's what writers do. The difference between a writer and a non-writer is that the writer never gives up on those modes of expression and ways of thinking. They continue with them. The final story in the collection, Timelines, as you've noted, is a different story. It doesn't have Martin in it. What that story is about is how a writer is born, how stories come into being. And you see in that story, Ginny, first of all, she's looking at a clock. She's thinking about her own wristwatch. She's wondering about how the wristwatch works. As she gets older, she's thinking about these things. She's adding to them. She's telling stories with her grandmother. She's then, as a young adult, she's becoming a writer, and she's given something up, but she's thinking about how she's going to turn that into fiction, and how an unsatisfactory relationship or a partially satisfactory relationship can actually be turned to the good in fiction. And then at the end of that story, you see that character almost walking out of her mind into his own story. People are very okay these days with the idea of virtual reality, of life behind the screen. They go to their computer, they log on, they're sort of interacting with a space that isn't there. Written fiction is the first version of the internet. It's absolutely, and it's bigger and it's more infinite, and it doesn't crash. You can do it. You don't have to interface with any machinery. You just access it with your imagination. But it is that same invisible wall, invisible barrier you pass through, and you're into another set of realities that are there, and in a sense they're as much there as the reality we're sitting in now. Objects can take on an almost sort of talismanic quality. You invest them with your emotions and your memories. The watch in Timelines, the silver half hunter that Ginny polishes on her grandmother's kitchen table, that watch existed. The Timelines, I should tell you, is semi-autobiographical. A lot of the incidents with the grandmother in that story are real. That's my grandmother. The story about my grandmother being adopted and her own biological father being a journalist on the Manchester Guardian is absolutely true. She told it to me in a different way. Things didn't happen exactly as they do in the story, but the outline facts are true. And that silver half-hunter watch was real, and it was kept behind my grandmother's wardrobe, and it was the property of her own adopted father, exactly as it says in the story. That was a real object, and whenever I went to her house to visit, I loved that watch. I wanted to hold it, I wanted to polish it, I liked flipping open the case. I thought it was a beautiful thing, and it wasn't just beautiful in itself, it was the idea that it had belonged to her father. All these layers of history and different people coming together in that object, and a house even more so. I love houses, and I love houses in London. I love the English terraced house, these sort of very simple Victorian and older sort of houses which I mean, by the time we're talking about them now, you've probably had 10 generations of people living in that. So you move in, you're just a temporary custodian. You can never own that house, and it's sort of layers of time building up, and houses are intensely emotive in that way, and intense sort of repositories of memory, and it's impossible for me not to write about that. It's a subjective, it's absolutely objective. We all have watches, there's atomic clocks ticking, we've measured time, but the lived moment is, everyone will remark on how subjective that is. Sort of like an hour spent in a doctor's waiting room will pass at a completely different speed from an hour spent in a cafe with friends. And it's this sort of interplay of the objective reality of time and the subjective reality of time as you live it is, again, it's a fascinating, sometimes frightening thing, but very interesting to explore in fiction. The reviews of my work, if you pulled them all together, the word that would recur most often is loss. People, and again, I think that arises from time. From a young age, I was conscious of being aware of time passing. Somewhere in one of his essays, the writer Nabokov refers to this phenomenon, this hypersensitivity to time, as chronophobia, a fear of time. And I think I've always had that, not a fear exactly, but an awareness that the moment is going, it's going. Sort of so many things throughout my life, I've been aware of them as I've been doing them and thinking, this is happening now and this will be gone. And I think a really large thrust of my writing is tied up with wanting to record the beauty of individual moments, what to readers, to make them think about similar moments in their own lives. That's what I suppose I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say that all lives are magical lives. That's what the lesson of the Martin stories is. Martin is an ordinary person who notices the magic in his life and keys into that. And that's what life itself is, a miracle. I love mechanical watches, and I love the idea of a mechanical watch being actually literally a time machine. What is a mechanical watch other than a time machine? It is a machine for measuring time. That's an impossible thing to do. Time actually doesn't exist. There's no real objective reality. Time is something that human beings have created for their own convenience. It's natural to me. I often think I was born with a love of the literature of the fantastic. I can't imagine writing anything that didn't contain some kind of element of the fantastic, which it was a sort of natural way of both expressing myself and of finding works that excited me. I was just like totally captivated by these ideas of projecting your imagination onto the world and seeing what happened. You could do anything with it. And I read Russian literature at university, and I know 19th century Russian literature and 20th century Russian literature. I know all the big Russian classics like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Turgenev, and I know those better than I know Dickens. I knew that way of interacting with the world. Is sort of, if you think about a novel by Dostoevsky, for example, you've got the central questions in that novel are going to be about God and the devil and the meaning of existence. In a Dickens novel, it's a much more social. It's about the social order. It's about the class system. It's about progress of the Industrial Revolution. It's about sort of a different set of things. And so sort of I think from a young age, right up through my university career, I naturally gravitated towards the spiritual side, the kind of, if you like, the more abstract side of things. I wasn't really interested in the class system, or, you know, how to hold your teacup, or sort of like this idea of battling with the demons and asking the great questions. And I think that fantastic literature still provides the best way of doing that, because it's such a rich source of metaphor. You can use, as you say, an alternate England or France or America, whatever. I mean, in The Silver Wind, there's the big central story in the collection shows you an alternate version of London, where there's this terrible government's come to power, and you've got racism, and you've got, you know, really appalling miscarriages of justice and a form of dictatorship. And it's a way of it's a way of actually warning people, if you like, this could happen. Climate change, you can explore everything through the fantastic. It's the most versatile medium, and I can't ever imagine not wanting to do that. It's a very strange feeling to know that people are reading me now in another language. Really incredible. A story translated into German for a magazine called Phase X, and another story that was translated into Czech. But Bernard Siegel has translated several stories, so his translation of my earlier story, Microcosmos, was the first foreign language translation of my work, definitely. And it's all because of Bernard that this book exists, because he found it and read it and liked it and asked if I'd be willing to have it translated, which of course I'm only too happy. It's difficult to describe because I'm publishing in British magazines and my short stories have been published by British publishers. It's a very complicated literary landscape, because all the readers that know me and the people in the publication, in the world of publication that know me, it's in the world of science fiction and fantastic literature, and I've been published in science fiction and fantasy magazines now since, I think my first story was published in 2002, so it's just over 10 years. I've published over 50 stories in English and 3 collections now. They're all what you'd call literary science fiction. It's not the popular kind of science fiction with big monsters or spaceships, the things that maybe the general public think of when you say the word science fiction. They're thinking of Doctor Who and they're thinking of Star Wars, and I don't write like that at all. I write with elements of the fantastic, elements of the future, elements of speculation. I always prefer the term speculative fiction. For French readers who are probably familiar with the work of English writers such as J.G. Ballard, or for example American Philip K. Dick, these kind of areas of the fantastic do deal with psychology and inner landscapes and the human being reacting to elements of those things coming in upon them, the human reaction to change and the human reaction to the strange. I think that's the best way I could describe my work. H.G. Wells's novel The Time Machine was, I think, as far as I can remember, I've thought about this a lot, I think that was the first work of science fiction I ever read, and I read it after seeing the 1960 famous film of The Time Machine, and I was enthralled by that movie, and I read the book. I was about 10 or 11 years old, and that book has been a constant inspiration, that just the sort of ideas that are there almost in the first section, where the time traveller is trying to explain how time travel might be possible. Carson McCullers is just a writer that I love. I love Southern American Gothic. I love that kind of sense of a steaming hot landscape with tensions building and strange old houses.